Darkness rolled over the English Channel like a heavy shroud. The wind howled through the rigging of hundreds of ships, transports, destroyers, landing craft, all swaying in restless anticipation. Lightning flashed across the distant horizon, revealing whitecaps and pale faces. The largest invasion fleet in human history waited in silence. Inside one of the packed transport vessels, First Lieutenant Jimmie W. Monteith Jr., 26 years old, leaned against a steel bulkhead. Around him, the men of Company L, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, sat shoulder to shoulder. Some wrote letters they would never send. Others polished rifles that already gleamed. The air was thick with the smell of oil, salt, and fear. Monteith's calm voice broke the tension. "Get some rest if you can. We land with the tide, and the tide waits for no man." No one truly slept. They all knew what awaited them on the far shore. The cliffs of Omaha Beach, the machine guns of the Atlantic Wall, the minefields stretching into the surf. For months they had trained for this, rehearsing every step, every landing. But training could not prepare a man for the real thing, for the sound of bullets against steel, for the smell of cordite and burning flesh. For Monteith, Normandy was not the beginning of war. He had fought in North Africa and Sicily, and he had seen what battle did to men. He carried that quiet weight with him, an understanding that courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to move forward despite it. Tomorrow, that truth would be tested on the bloodiest beach of them all. A phonograph crackled softly in a corner, playing Moonlight Serenade. A few soldiers hummed along, their minds drifting to home, Virginia, Kansas, Ohio. Monteith checked his watch. 0200 hours. He had memorized every contour of Omaha from the briefing maps: Vierville, Colville, St. Laurent. The tide tables, the shingle, the exits, every detail, except whose names would be written in the sand by dawn. Sergeant Tom Wilkins muttered beside him, "They say Jerry's been waiting for months. MG 42 seconds, bunkers, mines everywhere. Will be fish in a barrel." Monteith answered quietly, "Then we'll break the barrel." A few men laughed under their breath. The sound wasn't joy, it was relief. Even small words of defiance helped steady their hands. At 0300 hours, the call came down the passageway, all units to prepare for loading. The men climbed onto the open deck. The cold air slapped their faces. The sea heaved below, glowing faintly under the moon. Far on the horizon stretched a line of flickering lights, the invasion fleet itself, an endless constellation of ships. Monteith helped a young private tighten the straps of his overloaded pack. The boy couldn't be more than 19. "Sir, you think we'll make it ashore?" "We'll make it," Monteith said, "and we'll hold it. Just stay close." Nearby, a chaplain moved among the soldiers, offering short prayers. Others clutched dog tags or whispered goodbyes. Over the distant horizon, the sky began to pale the faintest gray of approaching dawn. Across the channel, in Normandy, German sentries watched the waves under a sky streaked with cloud. They saw nothing yet, but soon the horizon would glow red. Monteith stood at the railing, the wind tearing at his coat. He could taste salt on his lips and hear the distant thunder of naval guns beginning their bombardment. The ocean ahead of him flashed with bursts of light ships firing at the shore, explosions flickering like heat lightning. He remembered a briefing only days before, in a damp tent in southern England. Colonel George Taylor's voice had carried over the crackle of a lantern. "You men are the tip of the spear. You will go ashore under fire. You will take that beach. And when you do, you will open the door to Europe." Monteith had understood what that meant. To open that door, thousands might have to die turning the handle. The engines roared to life. The ramps lowered, and soldiers began descending rope ladders into the tossing LCVP landing craft below. Each man vanished into the dark sea spray until only a few silhouettes remained. Monteith followed, boots splashing onto the metal deck of the craft. He gripped the railing as waves slammed against the hull. The coxswain shouted over the noise, "Destination Easy Red Sector, Omaha Beach." The first shells streaked across the sky. The naval guns thundered behind them. The horizon bloomed with fire. The storm had begun not one of wind and rain, but of steel and flame. As dawn crept over the English Channel, Jimmy Monteith and his men sailed straight into the heart of it. In a few short hours, the fate of Europe would be written on a strip of sand called Omaha. The gray light of dawn broke slowly over the channel, revealing a vast and terrible beauty. Hundreds of ships stretched to the horizon, an armada so immense it seemed to blot out the sea itself. Destroyers cut through waves like silent predators. Landing craft bobbed in long lines behind them, each one packed with young men gripping rifles, eyes fixed on the fog ahead. Jimmy Monteith stood near the bow of his landing craft, rain and salt water dripping from his helmet. The wind whipped his face, cold and sharp. Every few seconds, a flash of light from the horizon revealed the men's expressions grim, silent, pale. No one spoke. Words were useless now. The boat lurched violently as the channel swells pounded the hull. Several men lost their balance and fell hard onto the metal floor, cursing. Vomit mixed with seawater and mud. The smell was thick and sour. For those who had never seen combat, the sea itself felt like an enemy. "Keep your heads down," the coxswain shouted over the roar of the engine. "We're 5 miles out." Monteith nodded, gripping his M1 carbine. Every muscle in his body was tight. He wasn't afraid of dying, he had accepted that days ago, but he feared failing his men. He glanced behind him. The young private he'd spoken to hours before was trembling, clutching his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. Monteith leaned closer, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Remember your training. You get off that ramp and move. Don't stop, don't look back." The boy nodded, swallowing hard. The sky grew brighter by the minute. The first red streaks of morning stretched across the clouds. Ahead, the French coastline began to appear low, dark, and distant. Through the binoculars of the naval escorts, the shapes of bunkers and fortifications became clear. The Germans were waiting. Suddenly, a thunderous crack split the morning. A German coastal gun had fired. Seconds later, the shell landed in the water 100 yards away, sending up a column of spray taller than a house. Another followed, then another. The calm of dawn was shattered. Monteith's landing craft shuddered as shrapnel clattered across the metal sides. "Stay low," he yelled. Men crouched behind their gear, gripping helmets. The sea erupted with explosions as shells rained down all around them. Far ahead, destroyers opened fire in reply, their guns flashing orange against the gray sky. The noise was deafening. Columns of smoke rose from the coastline, but even through the haze, Monteith could see the bluffs looming above the beaches. He knew that high ground would become a slaughterhouse. 2 miles, the coxswain yelled. "Prepare for enemy fire." Machine gun tracers began stitching the water in front of them, bright red lines bouncing off the waves. One boat to their left took a direct hit. It vanished in a burst of fire and spray. When the smoke cleared, nothing was left but floating debris and the faint outline of a body drifting face down. A young soldier in Monteith's craft whispered a prayer under his breath. The sound was lost to the wind, but Monteith heard the fear in his voice. He rested a hand on the man's shoulder. No words were needed. The beach was close now. Monteith could see the outlines of the obstacles rising from the surf-angled metal crosses, stakes with mines fixed on top, the deadly teeth of the Atlantic wall. Beyond them, muzzle flashes danced from hidden bunkers. The coxswain screamed, 30 seconds. Monteith checked his weapon and tightened his chin strap. Around him, the men did the same. The air was alive with sound, the roar of engines, the shriek of artillery, the hammering of German MG 42 seconds firing from the bluffs. The sea was now stained with smoke and blood from boats that had gone before them. 20 seconds. Bullets slapped the water, spraying cold mist into their faces. A mortar exploded near the bow, sending fragments slicing through the air. A man fell beside Monteith without a sound. 10 seconds. When that ramp drops, move. Monteith turned to his men one last time. No matter what happens, keep moving forward. The ramp dropped with a crash. Instantly, the front of the craft lit up with tracer fire. The first men out were cut down before their boots touched the sand. Monteith jumped into waist-deep water, dragging one wounded soldier aside as bullets hissed all around. He felt the shock of cold rip through his legs. The noise was overwhelming, screams, gunfire, explosions, chaos. All around him, Men were falling. Some tried to take cover behind the steel obstacles jutting from the surf. Others crawled forward, desperate to reach the shore. The sea turned red as waves rolled over the bodies of the dead and dying. Monteith fought against the current, forcing his way toward land. The weight of his pack dragged him down, but he pushed harder. Sand filled his boots. The stench of smoke and cordite hung heavy in the air. He shouted to the survivors near him, "Move! Move up the beach! Don't stop!" They obeyed. Somehow, amid the chaos, the lieutenant's voice cut through the storm. He was already ahead of them, carbine raised, moving toward the base of the cliffs. Behind them, the channel burned. Ahead, the beaches of Normandy waited an inferno of fire and steel. The ramp fell, and hell opened. Bullets tore through the front of the landing craft before the men even touched the water. The first row collapsed, instantly cut down by a storm of MG-42 fire raking across the surf. The air was filled with screams and splashes, the deafening roar of machine guns, and the shriek of ricochets. Monteith dove sideways into the freezing water, dragging a wounded soldier with him as rounds stitched the surface like raindrops. He hit the sand hard, the shock of the cold biting through his uniform. Water rushed around him, thick with blood and fragments of shattered gear. Men tried to climb out of the surf only to be struck down mid-stride. Helmets spun away like tossed coins. The sea had turned red. Monteith looked up toward the bluffs. The entire shoreline was alive with muzzle flashes, fortified bunkers carved into the hillside, hidden gun ports spewing fire. German mortars rained shells that erupted in columns of sand and shrapnel, shredding everything exposed. The noise was beyond comprehension, a continuous, rolling scream of metal and terror. He could see what had gone wrong immediately. The tide had pushed them too far east. They had landed directly in front of the strongest defenses of Omaha's easy red sector. There was no cover, no trenches, no dunes, only wet sand, barbed wire, and death. Monteith waved his arm toward the nearest men still alive. "Get to those obstacles. Use them for cover." A handful of soldiers crawled after him, clinging to the twisted metal of Czech hedgehogs jutting from the beach. Bullets sparked off the steel inches from their faces. One man clutched his helmet with both hands and screamed for a medic who would never come. Another tried to stand, only to be thrown backward by an invisible punch. Monteith forced himself to stay calm. Panic would kill faster than bullets. He checked his weapon. It was jammed with sand. He slammed it against his leg until it clicked. Around him, men were scattered and leaderless. Officers had been killed within seconds of landing. A shell exploded nearby, flipping a landing craft end over end. The blast knocked Monteith flat. His ears rang, his vision swam, but through the haze he saw movement survivors crawling toward the seawall 200 yards ahead. That was their only hope. He shouted again, voice hoarse but commanding. "Forward! Get off the beach." A young private hesitated beside him, frozen in place. Monteith grabbed him by the shoulder and pointed toward the ridge. "You stay here, you here, move." The man nodded, terrified but alive, and started crawling. Monteith followed, low to the ground, dragging another wounded soldier behind him. The sand was hot with burning fragments, slick with blood, heavy under the weight of packs. Each yard forward felt like a mile. Above them, a tank burned its crew trapped inside, pounding on the hatch as flames poured from the turret. The smell of burning oil and flesh mixed with salt and smoke. Monteith forced himself not to look. There was no time to grieve. Mortars whistled overhead. Another blast threw sand into his mouth and eyes. He coughed, spat, and crawled onward. Near a cluster of obstacles, he spotted two soldiers pinned down behind a steel beam, their radios smashed, faces pale with shock. "Who's in command here?" Monteith yelled. "Don't know, sir. Everyone's down." Monteith took a breath and made the decision. "Then I am." He started shouting orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Spread out! Find working weapons! Suppress those guns on the bluff!" A few men rallied to him, shaking off their fear. They fired short bursts toward the cliffs, not to hit but to distract. The gesture mattered. It meant they were still fighting. Another wave of soldiers splashed ashore nearby, already taking heavy casualties. Monteith ran to meet them, bullets snapping past his head. He dragged one man to cover, kicked another's pack loose when it threatened to drown him, and pointed toward the seawall. "Head for that wall. Don't bunch up. Keep moving." He led by example, sprinting through the shallow surf under fire, never staying still long enough to be an easy target. His uniform was soaked, his boots filled with water, his lungs burned, but his men saw him moving, and that kept them alive. They reached a section of the beach littered with the wreckage of landing craft. Monteith crouched behind a half-sunken boat, gasping for breath. Around him, maybe 20 men had made it this far. The rest were gone. He peeked over the edge. The bluffs loomed high above, crowned with concrete bunkers spitting flame. Between him and the ridge lay another 100 yards of open sand. No cover, no mercy. A mortar round landed nearby, spraying metal shards. Monteith wiped blood from his cheek. "We've got to push up that hill," he said. "If we stay here, we die here." One soldier shook his head. "Sir, we'll never make it." Monteith looked him straight in the eyes. "Then we make them believe we will." He waited for the next explosion, then rose to his feet and ran forward into the smoke. A few followed, then more. Crawling, sprinting, stumbling, they moved because he moved. The beach that had seemed like a graveyard was suddenly alive with motion. Amid the roar of gunfire and the cries of the dying, the faintest spark of hope began to flicker. Jimmie Monteith, drenched, wounded, and covered in sand, kept leading from the front one of the few officers still standing on Omaha Beach. Behind him, the sea kept bringing more men. Ahead of him, the ridge waited. And somewhere beyond that ridge, the liberation of Europe had already begun. The tide was rising fast, swallowing the beach and the dead alike. The sound of machine guns echoed from the bluffs, an unbroken rhythm of death. Smoke drifted low across the sand, turning the world gray. Jimmie Monteith crouched behind a burned-out landing craft, catching his breath, his uniform stiff with salt and blood. He scanned the slope ahead. The seawall was still 200 yards away, the bluffs another 200 beyond that. The men around him, fragments of different platoons, looked to him for direction. Their faces were pale and streaked with dirt. They were out of formation, low on ammunition, and pinned between the surf and the cliffs. Monteith pointed toward the ridge. "That's where the fire's coming from. We get up there, we live. We stay here, we don't." A corporal beside him shouted over the gunfire, "Sir, the minefields. The whole approach is trapped." Monteith nodded grimly. He knew. The engineers meant to clear the mines had been killed in the first minutes of the landing. Now, it was chaos, men stumbling into live fields, tanks stuck in the surf, wounded crying for medics who'd never come. He looked out to sea. 2 amphibious Sherman tanks were crawling toward shore, their turrets barely above the waves. If they reached land intact, they could silence the bunkers on the ridge. But if they hit a mine before that, everyone nearby would die. Monteith stood up, waving both arms. "Over here. Follow me in." The nearest tank commander, a sergeant with his head sticking out the hatch, saw him and nodded. The tank groaned forward, treads grinding against the sand. Monteith turned to his men. "We're moving with them. Keep 10 yards apart. Step where I step." He started forward, crouched low, moving across the open beach. Every step could have been his last. The sand was uneven, scarred by craters. Shattered rifles and bodies littered the way. Each footprint was a gamble between life and death. The first tank reached the shallows and climbed onto the sand. A shell exploded beside it, rocking the hull but not stopping it. The turret swung toward the cliffs, spitting fire. The second tank followed, firing bursts into a bunker high above. Monteith used their thunder as cover, motioning for the men to advance. They moved in short bursts, diving behind obstacles when the machine guns opened up again. The air was thick with dust and smoke. Monteith could feel the ground shake as mines detonated somewhere to his left, a muffled thump followed by a cloud of sand. "Stay in line," he yelled. "Keep low." A private just behind him stepped too far from the marked path. A blinding flash swallowed him whole. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but torn webbing. Monteith didn't look back. He couldn't. The tanks crawled forward inch by inch. Their tracks crushed some of the mines, detonating others in shallow bursts that rocked the steel monsters but didn't stop them. One tank reached the edge of the seawall, its turret pounding the concrete positions above. Monteith waved for his men to take cover behind the armor. They pressed themselves into the sand as the tank fired again, the concussion slamming into their chests. The smell of burnt powder filled the air. "Lieutenant!" shouted Sergeant Wilkins, appearing beside him, face streaked with grime. "Radio's dead! We can't reach command!" "Then we don't wait for orders," Monteith replied. "We push forward, use the tanks as cover." They began advancing in the shadows of the two Shermans, moving from crater to crater. German mortars exploded along the beach, hurling sand and steel into the air. Shrapnel ripped through the tank's side skirt, but it kept rolling, its engine roaring like an animal. Monteith led the men to a narrow gap between two patches of barbed wire. Beyond it, the slope of the bluff rose sharply. That was their route up steep, exposed, deadly. He turned to the corporal beside him. "Get the men ready. When those guns lift, we move." A shell from one of the tanks struck a bunker head-on. Concrete split open, flames bursting from the gun port. For the first time that morning, Monteith heard something new on the wind, German voices shouting in panic. He rose to his feet. "Go." The men surged forward, climbing the incline under cover of the tanks. The sand gave way to chalky soil, slippery with mud and blood. Monteith hauled one man up by the straps of his pack as they ascended, bullets whistling past their helmets. A mine detonated behind them, throwing dirt and smoke over the slope, but the line kept moving. Halfway up, one of the tanks hit a buried charge. The explosion lifted it off the ground, flipping it sideways in a burst of fire. The blast threw Monteith to his knees. Burning fuel splashed across the sand, lighting the slope in orange flame. He shielded his face from the heat, shouting for his men to keep climbing. The second tank rumbled forward alone, its treads clanking through the debris, its gun pounding the ridge relentlessly. By the time they reached the halfway mark, most of the company was gone, cut down or scattered. But the survivors clung to the slope like ghosts. Above them, the enemy still fired, but the angles were changing. They were getting closer. Monteith turned back for one last look at the beach. Smoke hung low over the water. Landing craft still came ashore, still emptying men into chaos. He could barely tell sea from sky. Then he looked upward again to the ridge, to the faint outline of trenches silhouetted against the gray light, and kept climbing. Somewhere behind him, a man shouted, "Lieutenant, we're nearly there." Monteith didn't answer. His jaw was set, his carbine gripped tight. They were through the minefields now. Ahead lay the heart of the German defenses and the narrow chance to turn the tide. The slope rose before them like a wall of earth and smoke. Above, the cliffs of Omaha bristled with machine guns and mortar pits, each one spitting death into the chaos below. The men of Company L were scattered, no clear lines, no radio contact, no coordination, only survival and instinct. Monteith crouched behind a jut of rock halfway up the bluff. His uniform was torn, his helmet dented, his hands bleeding where he had dug into the wet soil to climb. Beside him, a private pressed his back to the ground, breathing in ragged gasps. The smell of burned cordite and pulverized sand clung to everything. Monteith looked up the hill. They had to reach the top. Without that ridge, there was no foothold for the rest of the invasion. Below them, the sea was still vomiting smoke and fire. Landing craft burned like floating torches, their decks slick with oil and bodies. The sight hardened something in him. He rose to a crouch. "Move," he shouted. "One at a time, use the craters. Keep your heads down and move." The men began crawling upward in bursts, scrambling from one shell hole to another. The Germans above fired relentlessly, their MG-42 seconds chewing the air into ribbons. Dirt kicked up inches from Monteith's face as he dove behind a broken log. He lifted his carbine, aimed toward a gun nest that flashed from the ridge, and squeezed off 3 shots. He didn't know if he hit anything, but it made the gunners flinch. That was enough. He motioned to a nearby rifleman. "Grenade that position?" The soldier pulled the pin, counted, and hurled the grenade high. It disappeared into the brush, then detonated with a roar. The machine gun went silent. Monteith seized the moment. "Go! Keep climbing!" They advanced another 20 yards, slipping on the loose slope, clinging to roots and rocks. Above them, The remaining Sherman tank fired one last shell before its gun jammed. The explosion cracked open another bunker wall, spraying concrete dust into the air. Monteith felt the debris rain down on his shoulders. At the base of the ridge, Sergeant Wilkins and a handful of survivors fought their way upward to join him. "We've got men from D Company mixed in," Wilkins panted. "Nobody knows who's who anymore." "Then they're ours now," Monteith said. "Form a line. We hit that trench together." The sergeant nodded, yelling down the slope to gather anyone still alive. Within minutes, a ragged dozen men assembled behind Monteith, mud-covered, exhausted, but ready. He looked at their faces. Some he recognized, others were strangers. It didn't matter. For this moment, they were one unit. Gunfire cracked from the ridge. A burst of bullets shattered the dirt in front of them. Monteith pointed upward. "That's the last nest before the crest. We take the hill." He led the charge himself, sprinting up the incline, weaving between bursts of fire. Bullets whined past his ears. The ground seemed to explode beneath every step. He could hear nothing but his own heartbeat. Halfway up, a mortar round landed close. The shockwave threw him forward, slamming him into the earth. His helmet flew off, and his ears rang, but he crawled onward, refusing to stop. He reached for his weapon, fired from the hip toward the gun flash above. Behind him, the men followed, shouting, stumbling, firing as they climbed. One was hit and fell backward, tumbling down the slope. Another crawled forward, dragging a wounded comrade with him. Monteith reached a ledge just below the crest. He could see the edge of a trench line 10 yards ahead, a machine gun nest firing blindly down the hill. He gestured to Wilkins. "Cover me!" He dashed forward, rolling into the trench as bullets snapped past. The German gunner swung the weapon toward him, but Monteith was already there, tackling him hard into the dirt. They struggled in the narrow space, the German shouting, Monteith striking with his rifle butt until the man went still. Wilkins and the others poured in behind him, clearing the position in seconds. Smoke drifted through the trench. A few Germans surrendered, others ran. The Americans turned their captured gun toward the next bunker and opened fire, the same weapon that had slaughtered their comrades now roaring in their hands. The sound of its bursts echoed across the ridge. For the first time all morning, the return fire began to falter. Monteith climbed onto the edge of the trench, scanning the terrain. The ridge stretched east and west, dotted with bunkers, trenches, and pillboxes. Far below, the next waves of infantry were landing under the same hellish fire. If they could hold this position, others could follow. He waved his men forward. "Secure the line. Get those guns turned inland." The soldiers fanned out, firing into nearby positions. German troops began to fall back toward the village behind the ridge. The tide had shifted, but barely. Wilkins approached, wiping grime from his face. "Sir, we actually did it." Monteith didn't smile. His eyes stayed on the distant horizon, where smoke and fire still rose from the sea. "We're not done yet." He looked back down the slope they'd climbed, littered with helmets, weapons, and the bodies of the men who hadn't made it. The cost was written into the earth itself. As the wind carried the stench of gunpowder and blood, Monteith knew this was only the beginning. The ridge was theirs for now, but counterattacks would come soon. He had to hold until reinforcements arrived or die trying. He turned to his men. "Dig in, get ready. The next storm's coming." And as they set to work fortifying the battered slope, the sound of distant German artillery began again, slow, deliberate, and closer than before. The ridge was theirs barely. The smoke still drifted from burning bunkers, mingling with the sea fog that rolled inland. The men of Company L, what was left of them, clung to the shattered earth like ghosts. Every heartbeat felt borrowed. Monteith crouched in the captured trench, his face streaked with soot and blood. Around him, soldiers dug frantically into the soil with entrenching tools, trying to carve some semblance of cover before the next barrage came. Their hands shook from exhaustion, their eyes hollow from shock. But they worked. They always worked. "Keep your spacing," Monteith ordered. "Get those guns up. Ammunition here, wounded there." Sergeant Wilkins jogged toward him, crouched low. "Sir, we've got maybe 20 men." That's counting stragglers from other outfits. Ammo's half gone. We don't have any radio contact with the beach. Monteith nodded. Then we fight with what we've got. He stood, scanning the terrain through his binoculars. From this height, he could finally see the full sweep of Omaha Beach. It was a vision both magnificent and horrifying. The shoreline was choked with smoke and wreckage. Tanks burned. Bodies floated in the surf. But behind it all, more landing craft were coming. Waves of them. Reinforcements. The invasion hadn't failed. It was still coming alive beneath the thunder. He turned to Wilkins. We hold this ridge. If we fall back, the whole beach collapses. Wilkins gave a grim smile. Then I guess we hold it. A distant rumble drew Monteith's attention eastward. German armor. He could hear it now, the grinding of treads, the mechanical growl echoing through the hedgerows behind the ridge. They were regrouping. Positions, Monteith shouted. Watch those approaches. The men dropped into their makeshift foxholes. One set up a Browning machine gun facing a narrow gully that led inland. Others loaded captured MG-42 seconds scavenged from dead Germans. Every weapon, every bullet mattered. Minutes later, mortar fire began to fall. The first shell landed short, throwing dirt into the air. The next one found its mark. It exploded against the trench wall, showering the men with debris. A soldier screamed, clutching his leg. Monteith slid beside him, wrapping a torn field dressing around the wound. "You're fine, soldier. Stay with me. Stay low." More shells followed. The ridge shook under the bombardment. Chunks of earth collapsed into the trenches. Yet amid the chaos, Monteith moved steadily, calling out positions, checking each man, dragging the wounded out of open ground. His presence alone steadied them, the kind of leadership born not of rank, but of resolve. "Here they come," someone yelled. Through the drifting smoke, figures appeared, German infantry advancing in staggered lines, firing as they moved. They were shouting orders in harsh bursts, rifles cracking in the open. Monteith raised his carbine. Hold now." The ridge erupted. Rifles, machine guns, grenades, everything fired at once. The first wave of Germans stumbled, falling into the grass. A few made it to cover behind rocks and logs, returning fire, but the Americans held their ground. Wilkins' machine gun jammed. Monteith slid beside him, slammed the bolt back, and cleared the round. "You're good, keep it hot." The Germans tried again, this time flanking from the right. Monteith saw the movement and sprinted across open ground to cut them off, shouting for two riflemen to follow. They dropped into a shallow depression and poured fire into the advancing troops, stopping the maneuver cold. An explosion hurled dirt across his back. He rolled to his knees, ears ringing, eyes stinging with smoke. Somewhere behind him, a voice cried out for a medic. He ignored the pain, focusing only on the rhythm of the battle, the bursts of gunfire, the short silences between reloads. For a moment, he caught sight of the German officer leading the assault, waving his men forward with a pistol. Monteith raised his carbine, aimed, and fired. The man fell. The momentum broke. The survivors hesitated, then retreated into the brush. The ridge went quiet, save for the crackle of fire and the labored breathing of men who had survived the impossible again. Monteith slumped against the trench wall, chest heaving. His canteen was empty, his throat raw. Wilkins crawled over, blood on his sleeve. "They'll come again, sir." "I know." Monteith wiped grime from his eyes. "And we'll be ready again." He looked out toward the sea. The horizon was alive with ships. Waves of landing craft still surged forward, even as smoke and flame rose around them. For the first time that day, Monteith felt a flicker of hope. The Germans had thrown everything at them, and yet they still stood. He checked his watch. It was just past noon. D-Day was only 6 hours old, but it felt like a lifetime. The sound of distant artillery echoed again from inland. Perhaps more enemy reinforcements, perhaps Allied shells. He couldn't tell. The world had become one continuous thunder. "Dig deeper," Monteith said quietly. "We're not leaving this ridge." The men nodded, too exhausted to speak. They dug in silence, their shovels clinking against spent shell casings buried in the dirt. Above them, gulls circled over the beach, their cries lost in the wind. And through it all, Monteith stood watch, mud-caked, sleepless, unyielding, knowing that holding this patch of blood-stained earth meant everything. If they failed, the sea would swallow Omaha. If they held, the Allies would have their foothold in Europe. He looked east toward the next ridge, where smoke rose in a black column. "Come on," he murmured, as if speaking to the other beaches. "Hold your ground." He didn't know that his own final stand was only hours away. The ridge had fallen silent again, but it was the silence that soldiers feared most, the kind that came before the next storm. Smoke drifted across the slopes like fog, clinging to the ground and blurring the lines between friend and enemy. The sea roared behind them, but up here, only the wind and the faint crackle of burning brush remained. Monteith wiped mud from his face and tried the field radio once more. Nothing but static. The set was cracked, its wires frayed from shrapnel. He hit the casing in frustration. "Still dead," he muttered. Sergeant Wilkins crouched nearby, his sleeve wrapped around a bleeding arm. "Command's not hearing us, sir. We're on our own." Monteith looked around. The truth was clear. They were cut off, no contact, no supplies, and no guarantee that anyone even knew they'd taken the ridge. Below them, Omaha Beach was still under fire. They could see the plumes of smoke rising from the shore where other units struggled to break through. "How many left?" Monteith asked. Wilkins hesitated. "Maybe 14 still able to fight. A few wounded bad. Some—" He didn't finish. Monteith nodded slowly. 14 men to hold a hill that the Germans wanted back more than anything else. He knew what was coming next. "Get everyone into position," he said. "If they come again, we'll make them pay for every inch." The men moved quietly, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. They were running on instinct now. They set up captured MG 42 seconds facing the approaches, stacked ammunition boxes from the fallen, and reloaded their weapons with trembling hands. Monteith crouched at the edge of the ridge, peering through binoculars. Through the haze, he could see movement in the tree line below, dark figures slipping between the shadows. Germans. They were regrouping for another counterattack. He lowered the glasses and turned to Wilkins. "They'll come soon. When they do, don't wait for orders. You see them, you fire." The sergeant gave a weary grin. "Aye, sir. No one's getting through us." The waiting was the hardest part. Minutes crawled by. The only sound was the wind moaning through the torn brush and the distant boom of naval guns somewhere beyond the horizon. Every man on that ridge knew what the silence meant. They had climbed through hell to get here. Now they would have to survive it again. Then came the first shot, a single crack from the tree line. A bullet whistled past Monteith's ear and buried itself in the dirt. Another followed, and another. The firefight erupted instantly. "Here they come," someone shouted. The Germans burst from the brush in small groups, firing as they advanced. Machine guns chattered from the flanks. Mortar shells began to fall, their blasts chewing into the slope. The Americans fired back, their rifles flashing in the smoke. The ridge exploded into chaos once more. Monteith moved between positions, shouting directions, hauling ammunition, dragging a wounded man into cover. His voice carried through the gunfire like a lifeline. "Hold the line, watch the right flank, don't waste rounds." A mortar shell landed close, sending dirt and shrapnel into the air. Monteith hit the ground hard. His helmet clattered away. For a moment he couldn't hear anything but a dull ringing in his ears. When his vision cleared, he saw Wilkins firing from behind a rock, his wounded arm bleeding freely. Monteith crawled toward him. "We're almost dry," Wilkins yelled. "Then make every shot count," Monteith shouted back. The Germans pushed closer, their helmets bobbing through the smoke. Monteith grabbed a fallen soldier's rifle and fired until it clicked empty. He tossed it aside, grabbed another. The ground around him was littered with brass and blood. "Grenades," he called. A private near him pulled the pin and threw. The explosion tore through the advancing line, scattering the enemy momentarily. The air was thick with dust and screams, but they kept coming. For every man that fell, another appeared from the tree line. Monteith crawled to the nearest MG 42, its barrel glowing red. He took over from the gunner, pressing the trigger in controlled bursts. The weapon roared, cutting through the undergrowth. German soldiers dropped, one after another, but still they pressed forward. Suddenly, a grenade landed just feet from him. Monteith kicked it away, throwing himself down as it detonated midair. The blast sent hot fragments slicing into his leg, but he pulled himself back up, teeth clenched. He could feel the ridge trembling under the bombardment, soil sliding down the slope with every explosion. The smell of burned powder mixed with the metallic tang of blood. His men were shouting, reloading, firing, falling. There was no time to think, only to fight. Then, through the chaos, he heard the distant rumble of tank treads. His heart sank. The Germans had brought armor. "Wilkins," he yelled, "we've got company." The sergeant looked up, eyes wide. "We've got no rockets left, sir." Monteith scanned the ridge, thinking fast. "Aim for the infantry. Force them back. Keep the armor blind." They opened fire again, emptying their last magazines. The first German tank crested the lower slope, its gun swinging toward them. Monteith knew they couldn't stop it, but they could buy time. He turned to his remaining men, shouting over the roar of the approaching tank. "Hold this position. Reinforcements will find us. Just hold." But deep down, he knew no help was coming. As the tank fired, the blast ripped the ground apart. Dirt and smoke swallowed the ridge. Monteith staggered to his feet, deafened, half-blinded, still clutching his weapon. Around him, the survivors crawled, bleeding, reloading, refusing to surrender. Cut off, surrounded, and outnumbered, Jimmie Monteith still fought from the front, calm, unflinching, fearless. The ridge was turning to ashes, but as long as he stood, it would not fall. The ridge shook beneath their boots as the first German tank fired again. The shells screamed overhead and exploded behind them, flinging dirt, debris, and human fragments into the air. The blast knocked Monteith backward into the trench. His ears rang, and the world flickered white for a moment. When he blinked the dust from his eyes, the sky above the ridge was on fire. He rolled onto his stomach and pushed himself up. The men were still fighting. God help them, they were still fighting. Rifle fire cracked from every hollow, every crater. The ridge had become a jagged scar of earth and smoke, crawling with men too stubborn to die quietly. "Wilkins, report!" Monteith called. No answer. He spotted movement through the haze and saw the sergeant crawling toward him, dragging one useless leg. His helmet was gone, his face gray. "They're coming through the gully, sir," he rasped. "At least a platoon." Monteith grabbed him under the arm, pulled him into cover. "Stay down, you've done your part." Wilkins shook his head weakly. "So have you." Monteith didn't respond. He grabbed the nearest functioning rifle and peered over the trench lip. Below, dark shapes were climbing German infantry, moving fast, shouting in clipped bursts of command. He could see bayonets glinting in the smoke. The tank below them was grinding forward, treads crushing the slope. "Ready grenades," Monteith shouted. A few men still had them. They pulled pins and hurled them down the hill. The explosions tore gaps into the assault line, but the Germans kept coming. For every one that fell, another took his place. The Americans fired until their rifles clicked dry. Monteith's own weapon jammed. He tossed it aside and drew his sidearm. His leg throbbed where shrapnel had cut deep, but he forced himself up the slope again, staggering between the fighting positions. He could see their fear, the exhaustion in every face, but also their resolve. They would not break while he stood among them. That was the unspoken truth of the battlefield. Leadership was not shouted, it was shown. He reached the far flank, where two soldiers were pinned behind a burned-out machine gun. One was hit, clutching his stomach. The other fired blindly toward the advancing line. Monteith knelt beside them, took aim with the fallen man's rifle, and fired until the clip emptied. "Sir," the young soldier gasped, "they've got us surrounded." Monteith looked around. He was right. Through the smoke, German figures were appearing on both sides, now moving up the ridges, closing the ring. The Americans were trapped. "Then we hold this line as long as we can," Monteith said quietly. The boy nodded once. He knew what that meant. A shell exploded behind them, throwing Monteith face first into the dirt. His ears filled with a dull ringing again. He tasted blood. When he raised his head, the trench was gone, collapsed into a jagged wound of broken wood and stone. He crawled through the wreckage, dragging himself to where Wilkins lay. The sergeant's eyes were closed, his chest unmoving. Monteith pressed 2 fingers to his neck, then withdrew his hand. There was no time for grief. The tank below the ridge fired once more, its shell slamming into the slope just short of their position. Dirt cascaded down like rain. Monteith stood, coughing, staring down at the beast of steel crawling toward them. He waved to the last few men still alive. "Fall back to the crest. We'll hold them there." They scrambled upward, slipping in the loose earth. Monteith stayed behind until they reached cover, firing his pistol to slow the advance. When the last of his men were over the top, he turned and followed, limping, bleeding, eyes burning with sweat. They regrouped behind a patch of scrub near the crest. 7 men left. No radios, no ammunition to waste. Just raw willpower. The Germans were within shouting distance now. Voices in the fog, footsteps on gravel. Monteith crouched low, whispering to his men. "When they come over that rise, you hit them hard. Short bursts, then fall back toward the rocks. We make them think we're more than we are." They nodded. One man kissed his dog tag and tucked it back into his shirt. Another checked his last clip. The first German helmet appeared over the ridge, then another. Monteith waited until he saw their eyes and opened fire. The men beside him joined in, the ridge erupting in a sudden burst of thunder. German soldiers stumbled backward, returning fire blindly. Bullets hissed through the air, shredding the brush. A grenade landed between 2 Americans. One of them kicked it away just in time. The blast still threw them both down. Monteith rushed forward, firing until his pistol emptied. Then he drew his rifle again, fired a few last shots, and dropped behind cover. "Sir, we're out," a soldier cried. Monteith looked at him, then down the ridge where the enemy regrouped. He could see dozens now, maybe more, spreading out to flank them. He took a deep breath. "Then we fight with what we have left." He picked up a fallen German's rifle, worked the bolt, and fired one last time. The bullet struck true. He smiled faintly. Then the next shell came in closer, louder, unstoppable. The explosion tore through the ridge. When the dust cleared, the Germans advanced cautiously. The ridge was still. Bodies lay scattered among the craters. The sea wind howled through the smoke. They found him near the crest, still gripping his rifle, his body half buried in the dirt. His men lay around him, the ridge they had held now quiet at last. By the time American reinforcements reached that position hours later, the fighting had moved inland. The ridge was secured, but at a price written in blood. Jimmie W. Monteith Jr. was gone. But because he and his men had held their ground, Omaha Beach did not fall. The line held. The invasion lived. The sun was sinking toward the horizon when the shooting finally stopped. Smoke drifted lazily over the scarred slopes of Omaha Beach, where the echoes of battle still hung in the air. The tide had rolled in again, washing over the wrecks of landing craft and carrying the dead gently back to shore. Reinforcements from the 18th Infantry were the first to reach the ridge. Their boots crunched over shell casings and broken helmets. The earth was still warm, the smell of burned metal thick. Everywhere they looked, the evidence of desperate fighting cratered ground, shattered weapons, bodies sprawled across the trenches. One sergeant paused beside a lifeless figure half buried in the dirt. The man's hand still gripped a rifle. His uniform was torn, the 1st Infantry Division patch blackened with soot. On his collar, the single silver bar of a first lieutenant glinted faintly in the afternoon light. "Jesus," the sergeant whispered. "That's Monteith." Word spread quickly among the newcomers. An officer had led a handful of men up the ridge, held it all day against tanks and infantry, and never came down. The survivors who stumbled in from the slopes confirmed it. They spoke his name quietly, reverently, like something sacred. "Lieutenant Monteith," one wounded soldier said, his voice barely more than a rasp. "He never stopped moving. We thought he'd be the first to die, but he just kept pulling men forward. When we ran out of ammo, he kept fighting with whatever he could find. I saw him dragging wounded with one hand and firing with the other." Another man, covered in bandages, added, "He told us we'd hold that ridge or die trying. So we did." The medics worked in silence, tagging the fallen, carrying them to makeshift litters. Monteith's body was lifted carefully, wrapped in a torn canvas shelter half. A corporal reached down and retrieved his helmet, now dented and scorched, and placed it over his chest. Below the ridge, the beach that morning had been chaos. Now, it was victory, costly, bloody, but real. Engineers were clearing mines, unloading supplies. Sherman tanks rolled inland through the gaps the infantry had carved. The once unstoppable German defense was breaking apart. And high above it all, on the ridge where Monteith's men had died, the stars and stripes fluttered for the first time that day, hung from the barrel of a wrecked machine gun. As dusk fell, the sounds of the invasion shifted from battle to industry. Bulldozers growled across the sand, clearing debris for supply routes. Medics called out for morphine. Engineers shouted for cables and tools. The war machine had landed, and it would not leave until Europe was free. But among those who had climbed that bluff, there was little celebration. They moved through the ruins with quiet disbelief, stepping over spent cartridges and broken rifles, past the burned-out tank still smoking from the morning's inferno. A private stopped beside a captured German bunker. Inside, he found a photograph pinned to the wall, a young woman smiling, holding a child. He stared at it for a long moment before setting it gently back down. There were no victors here, only survivors. In the days that followed, reports of the battle reached the higher command. Field dispatches spoke of an isolated platoon led by Lieutenant Jimmie W. Monteith Jr. that secured the high ground under continuous enemy fire, enabling the landing force to break through. The phrase was clinical, detached. It did not capture the smell of smoke, the scream of shells, the courage of one man who refused to fall back. But the men who had seen it remembered. They told the story to anyone who would listen, how Monteith had led from the front when others froze, how he had organized a defense from chaos, how his final words had been orders, not pleas. One of them, a young radio operator, wrote home, "If you ever hear anyone say Omaha was won by luck, tell them it was won by men like Lieutenant Monteith. We followed him through fire, and when he fell, we just kept going because he told us to. That's why we made it." By the end of June, the Normandy beachhead was secure. The 1st Infantry pushed inland toward Saint and St. Lo. The dead were buried in long, straight rows on the bluffs overlooking the sea. Among them rested Jimmie W. Monteith Jr., his grave marked with a white cross. The inscription was simple: Jimmie W. Monteith Jr., 1st LT, U.S. Army, Virginia, June 6, 1944. The sea breeze whispered through the grass above him. Below, the waves washed endlessly against the sand he had helped to take. Years later, veterans would still speak of him when they gathered of the young officer who had led them through hell with steady eyes and a calm voice. His name appeared on the Medal of Honor roll, but those who knew him said that no medal could describe what he had done. He had shown them what courage truly meant, not the absence of fear, but standing tall in its shadow. The morning sun rose once more over Normandy, painting the beaches in quiet gold. The tide rolled in with a slow rhythm now, calm and steady, nothing like the chaos that had once consumed these shores. The same waves that had carried soldiers into fire now whispered softly against the sand, as if carrying the memory of their courage out to sea. On the bluff above Omaha Beach, rows of white crosses stretched toward the horizon. Each one stood in perfect silence, gleaming under the pale French sky. Among them was the grave of 1st Lieutenant Jimmie W. Monteith Jr., Row 12, Plot E, Grave 9. His name etched into marble, his story carved forever into the soul of the land he helped to free. The visitors who came here decades later could not know the sound of that morning, the hiss of bullets across water, the pounding of mortars, the shouted orders through smoke. But they could feel something deeper, the weight of sacrifice, the echo of a man who had stood against the impossible and refused to yield. Monteith's Medal of Honor citation would later be read aloud in the halls of Washington. It described, in measured words, how he had led men ashore through intense enemy fire, how he reorganized scattered troops, how he led tanks through minefields to destroy enemy positions, and finally, how he gave his life directing their defense. But paper could never capture the truth of it. The fear in the air, the chaos of the ridge, the moment when leadership became something more than command. He had not been the highest-ranking officer, nor the most experienced. He had simply been the man who refused to let others die without a chance. Back in his hometown of Lowmore, Virginia, word of his death reached his mother weeks later. The telegram was brief, official, merciless. She read it at the kitchen table where Jimmy had once eaten breakfast before school. The boy who used to fish in the river and dream of building things, not destroying them. Neighbors remembered him as polite, reserved, the kind of young man who would carry groceries for a stranger without being asked. When the war came, he volunteered first for the draft, then for officer training. He'd written home from England only days before D-Day. "Don't worry about me. We're trained. We're ready. Tell everyone back home we're going to make them proud." He did. For the men who survived Omaha, Monteith's name became a quiet legend, whispered in tents and trenches long after the invasion. Veterans who fought beside him remembered his calm under fire, the way he seemed to move through the battlefield untouched by fear. One survivor said, "He wasn't shouting. He wasn't hiding. He was just there. Wherever it was worst, that's where you'd find him." When the Army compiled its list of D-Day heroes, Monteith's actions stood out. The after-action reports from Company L read like fragments of myth. Led charge up slope. Directed tanks under fire. Refused evacuation. Last seen rallying men on hilltop. Each phrase carried a lifetime within it. In 1945, the Medal of Honor was presented posthumously to his mother. She accepted it with trembling hands, her eyes downcast as the citation was read aloud. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. The medal itself gleamed gold against the black ribbon in its case, but she never displayed it publicly. She kept it in a wooden box, wrapped in her son's letters. Today, the cemetery at Normandy faces the sea that took so many. Visitors walk among the graves, whispering names, leaving flowers, tracing their fingers along the engravings. And when they reach Monteith's cross, many pause. They read the words, then lift their eyes toward the ridge rising behind it. That ridge, the one he took and held, still stands as his monument. Historians write of D-Day as a triumph of strategy, logistics, and courage. But the victory was built on moments like Monteith's one-man standing, when all logic said to fall. The beach was won by thousands of such moments, but his shines brightest among them. The U.S. Army would later name a barracks in Germany after him. In Virginia, a stretch of road still bears his name. But his truest memorial lies here, in the quiet wind of Normandy, where his sacrifice lives on not in stone, but in the freedom of the world he helped save. As the sun sets over Omaha Beach, the wind carries a faint whisper across the fields and down to the waves below. It sounds almost like a voice, a reminder, echoing through time. We'll make it, and we'll hold it. He did both. And because Jimmie W. Monteith Jr. and men like him stood their ground on the 6th of June 1944, the tide of history changed forever. The sea moves on. The world remembers. The ridge still belongs to them,